So our first topic today is on is nitrogen constraining productivity of our perennial pastures with Lisa Warren. Lisa's a highly sought after pasture consultant. She always gives really sensible and practical advice. People often mistake us, and so I get all the credit for some of Lisa's work, which I'm always pretty happy to receive. And Lisa's going to be talking about nitrogen requirements in pastures and starting to give us an understanding of the nitrogen system. So thanks very much, Lisa.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, Lisa Miller, I'll just check you can see that okay?
Yeah, that's all good, Lisa.
It's all good. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming along to the seminar. Yes, as Lisa's outlined what I'm going to cover today, just going into a bit more detail about the nitrogen cycle and how that impacts on perennial pastures. I'll get my slides to move. Okay, so we hear a lot about phosphorus, a lot of work done on phosphorus, lots of guidelines about use of phosphorus. That nitrogen is actually a nutrient that's required in a lot more quantities than our other macronutrients. So it's often a bit sort of goes under the radar, and I suppose we assume that clovers is just there doing its job and we don't have to worry much about it. But the role of nitrogen is quite important because it does impact on the pasture quantity and the quality. So not only the amount of feed that we grow, but the actual quality. So it impacts on the metabolizable energy and the protein content. So every bit of extra grass you grow that's got more nitrogen availability will actually be better quality for the livestock. So the animal performance will be a lot higher. So nitrogen's obviously involved in all the growth processes in the pasture, also involved in amino acid formation, which is involved with protein synthesis, and also in the formation of chlorophyll. So that's often why in nitrogen deficient pastures we see that yellowy sort of look, which is the chlorophyll being affected there. So we've got the growth, the protein content of the feed quality, but it also has a quite marked effect on the species composition. So in the slide I've just got up there, you can see that this is just some test strips, a pasture that had nitrogen deficiency, Fleurus pasture. The bright green bit is a section that's been fertilised with urea in May, and this is sort of later on in the year, and you can see quite a marked effect on not just the amount of growth in that nice green Fleurus patch, but the actual contribution of the desirable perennial to the sward. All around it is silvergrass is dominating. So this has had nitrogen, it's also been rested, so it's given a chance for the perennials to come through. But you can see that silvergrass really dominating where N is deficient, where fixing up the nitrogen has actually bolstered the desirable grasses. So quite a marked effect. And also this has a carryover effect. We're going to have more carryover feed going into the end of the season. And I just should add, in that last slide, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur weren't actually limiting. There's really the nitrogen showing up there. So is nitrogen limiting pasture production? Well, nitrogen deficiencies are quite common in a lot of pastures that you may not realise. The obvious deficiency symptoms are, the yellowing leaves, particularly of the older leaves. That's pretty obvious, but often that's not what we see in a pasture situation. You might see that in a crop scenario. Not that common in pastures. So more often we see things like, as you can see in the picture on the left, urine patches. This is actually sheep pasture. So you can see urine patches in the sheep pasture, more common in cattle pastures. You'll see large urine patches and dung patches. So we've got poorer growth and paler colour, where there's a nitrogen deficiency. Once again, in these slides, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur are not limiting. So it's really nitrogen that's been highlighted here. In those nitrogen patches, we could have anything, 500 kilos of nitrogen per hectare in those little patches. So you can see what's possible if nitrogen is not limiting, how much extra feed we can grow, and also the quality of it. On the right-hand side shows, this is actually a trace element response, molybdenum, quite ordinary looking pasture on the left-hand side, and then putting that limiting nutrient, in this case it was a trace element, has allowed the clover to kick on and start to provide nitrogen to the pasture. So yeah, a lot of pastures there's a hidden hunger from nitrogen that we're not always aware of. So I just want to give a bit of an overview of the nitrogen cycle, and this will lead into our next two speakers, Belinda and Lee's presentation. They'll pick up on some of the more detail on some of the points I'm going to raise in this session. So I'm going to talk about the sources of N in pasture systems, the forms of nitrogen that the plants can use, when the nitrogen is supplied, and possible losses of N out of the system. So if we just look at firstly where the nitrogen is coming from, just move those out of the way. Trying to move our little faces off my slide. So in this diagram, this is the source of nitrogen. So we've got animals, obviously dung and urine, as you saw in the last slide, a lot of urine concentration, a lot of nitrogen. They're returning nitrogen back to the pasture through dung and urine. But in our grass clover systems, we're really relying on a legume. So whether it's subclover, lucerne, white clover, mainly subclover in probably most of your pastures, we're relying on the clover to take nitrogen gas from the air, so that's N2 in the air, and turn that into a nitrogen that the plants can use. So the clover is capable of grabbing its own nitrogen from the air and fixing it in its nodules. And Belinda will talk more about how we can optimise nitrogen fixation by legumes in the pasture. The other sources are if we put bags of nitrogen on, when that dissolves, that can release some nitrogen in the form of nitrate, which is the NO3 one, or ammonium, which is NH4. So depending on what product's being used, and Lee will talk more about how we can optimise the efficiency of nitrogen fertiliser use. So we've got a few sources there, and if we're not using bag nitrogen, then obviously most of it's coming from the nitrogen in the air via the clover content and that return of nutrients from the animals. But the thing is, the grasses, they can't directly use the nitrogen that the clover is making. The clover can use it as it makes it, but the grass can't get into that until it's recycled by microbes. So we have to wait till the pasture residues rot down and the nodules rot down and become part of the soil organic matter where the organic nitrogen is sitting and then it has to transform before the grasses can actually get at that. So the clovers aren't sitting there pumping into grasses all through the year when they're active. The clovers might be happy, but the grasses can't get hold of that. So the legume might be able to pump in 20 to 25 kilos of N per tonne of legume dry matter. And as I said, Belinda will talk more about some of the ways of optimising that. As I said before, urine, we could have patches of urine where there's 500 kilos of N per hectare. In the manure cattle, there could be 2,000 kilos of N per hectare, so quite a lot in those patches, which can have a carryover effect over a year or so in the manure. But most of the nitrogen that the animals are eating from the pasture is being excreted, and most will be returned. Some will be lost, but a lot of that's getting returned. So they're not actually taking a lot off. So the other important point here is that 98% of the nitrogen in the soil is in that organic form. So the plants can't access that until it's transformed into a mineral form. So when we're talking about the mineral form, that's only about 2% of the soil. So I'm not just talking about stuff that the fertiliser bag there is supplying. There's nitrate and ammonium kicking around in the soil. It has to be in those forms for the plants to be able to get hold of it, the plant roots to be able to access it. So while it's sitting in that organic pool, the pastures can't actually access that. So like I said, 98% of the nitrogen in the soil is in that organic form. So that leads on to the next bit, which is mineralisation. So this is a very important process that goes on in the soil. And this is where soil microbes actually convert the soil organic nitrogen. So that's stuff that's come from all those pasture residues that have broken down, decomposed into the organic matter, and then they're mineralised by soil microbes into ammonium and then into nitrate. So once we've had that process go on, then the plants are then able to uptake that. So whether it's coming in from organic matter, transformed into ammonium, nitrate, both those mineral forms can be taken up by the plants. Both the clovers and grasses can access those. And then, yeah, if the bag nitrogen is going on, it can be in the nitrate or ammonium form, depending on the type of product you're using. So as I said, so that mineralisation is a really important step. We need that to be occurring to be able to supply the mineral forms of nitrogen to the plants. So just to run through some of the factors that are affecting the mineralisation rate and the supply of N to pastures during the year. One of the key things is the amount of organic matter in the soil, so the carbon percentage of the soil, and which is linked to the organic nitrogen. So just for example, there's a few little rules of thumb that I've been able to come across in different studies. But just for example, if a soil had a carbon percentage of 3%, that might be capable of mineralising, providing 120 kilos of N per hectare year via mineralisation. So the amount of carbon, the amount of organic matter in the soil is a real driver of that. The more we have in the soil, the more potential pool of organic N we have to be mineralised. The type of residues are important. The more legume residue, of course, the more nitrogen we'll have potentially available. And also the speed of breakdown will be affected by the type of residues we have, the plant residues. Soil texture, so the more clay, well, obviously the more capacity to store organic matter, so that's linked back into that as well. But soil moisture and soil temperature are key players which drive the seasonal pattern of mineralisation during the year. So we tend to have, when it's warm and when there's soil moisture around, we should have good mineralisation. When it's dry, not much happens because the bugs aren't active. If it's cold, not much happens because the bugs aren't active. So if we've got some moisture and some warmth, the soil microbes will be more active. So we'll get a faster rate of mineralisation. So just for example, some studies done at Hamilton, Matthew Harrison and the team there, just to get some actual data on what sort of rate we're looking at. It's anything from 200 to 600 grams of nitrogen per hectare per day are some of the figures that they've measured. So obviously 200 in the winter time, up to 600 when it's warmer in the autumn or the spring. And that sort of transformed into a total of 150 to 220 kilos of N per hectare per year. So if you think about, what's in a bag, of urea, for example, versus what the actual pasture or the soil is supplying the pasture during the year. So it's way above what most people would be using if they were using any bag nitrogen. So that's a sort of range in a pasture that we could be expecting to have N supplied from this important mineralisation process. Sorry, my slides are just stuck. Okay, so just toning in on that mineralisation rate and what's going on there before I talk about where nitrogen might be lost out of the system. As I said, mineralisation, this important mineralisation step is faster when it's warm and when there's some soil moisture around. So obviously autumn and spring would expect this process to be happening at a faster rate. In winter it slows down, the soil microbes are less active, and also clovers, clover activity slowing down in winter too, so you'd expect nitrogen fixation to slow down as well. So that's why often in winter we see deficiencies in nitrogen, and we see responses to nitrogen, bag nitrogen. Normally in the autumn, if we've had a dry summer, there'll be, when it rains, we'll have a flush of release of mineral nitrogen. So there's usually a flush of N available in autumn for pastures, and often we get really good growth, particularly if it's still warm. But then we may run out of this as we move into the colder weather. If we've had a wet summer, for example, we might get a high rate of mineralisation. So we've got the moisture, we've got the warmth, the soil bugs can start breaking down the organic matter, and that can be great. There'll be mineral N available, and if you've got summer active species, you might have cocksfoot or, you know, summer active fescues, things like that, they'll be able to make good use of that nitrogen. If they can't use up the nitrogen that's available, we may actually get some losses of nitrate, which is in the diagram here just showing leaching, and it's worse in sandy soils, so not so bad in clay soils, but the sandier the soil, the lighter the soils, the more possibility of getting nitrate leaching. So that can happen at any time, not just in the summer. But if we do have a wet summer, like some areas have had this year, we may get some losses of N from that rain. We've had some plant uptake if you've had summer active species. So we can often find that in those sorts of years, we can have quite severe nitrogen deficiencies in the pasture. So I've seen that quite a lot. Good wet summer, lots of growth, and then we could go into winter with a lot of nitrogen deficiency. The other time we might not have enough mineralisation of nitrogen supplying the pasture is in early spring. The pasture actually might kick off growing faster than the rate of mineralisation. So mineralisation may not be able to keep up with that rapid pasture growth. So that's why sometimes in spring we can get responses to bag nitrogen as well. So just looking at the other N losses, I just mentioned the leaching. When we've got nitrogen kicking around in the soil in the nitrate form, it can be readily leached, and that's worse in sandy soil. So that can happen, not just as I mentioned in the summer, but happen other times of the year. We can also get nitrate converting to nitrous oxide and back to ammonia gas. That's called denitrification, and that tends to happen in waterlogged soils. So that can be going on there. If we're using bagged N, we can get some losses of volatilisation, and we get ammonia gas being produced. And that once again depends on what product you're using, and Lee will come back to that point. We get some losses in animal products, but not a lot in beef and lamb and wool. And then we can get some gaseous losses from that urine patches. So there's some losses, and yeah, and that, like I said, that mineralisation process is really important for driving that system. And when it slows down, the plants may not be able to get enough mineral nitrogen. And even the clovers that are supplying their own nitrogen, when it's cool, or if they get a bit waterlogged, they won't be making as much nitrogen for themselves. So we can even get nitrogen responses in legume pastures. How much nitrogen is needed by a pasture? Well, it's a bit of a hard one to give you a definitive figure, but I've just tried to give you some rubbery numbers. But if we think about a tonne of dry matter hay, it might remove 30 kilos of N per tonne. So if we grew 7 tonnes of dry matter of pasture per year, you know, we might need 200 kilos of N per hectare, something like that. But obviously when we've got pasture, it's being grazed, we're not removing all of the dry matter, we're not removing all of the N, and a lot of the N's being recycled by the animals during the year. But I suppose the point is that, I mentioned before we had that from that Hamilton study, there could be anything like 150 to 220 kilos of N being mineralised per year. So, you know, it's not that we're necessarily in a deficit in a pasture system if we've got good legume content, but the point is, even if we have high soil carbon and high mineralised N over the whole year, there can be times of the year when the mineralisation rate just can't keep up with the pasture demand. And I've just alluded to a couple of key times. Can be winter, can be early spring, and after a wet summer, you know, we can have issues there as well. So there can be opportunities for bagged N, and I'll leave it there because our next speakers will talk about, Linda talk about the opportunity to get more nitrogen into that organic nitrogen pool from the legume, and Lee will talk about optimising the use of bagged N.